All right, let's jump into another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling something pretty big, the American political landscape.
Oh, yeah. This one is always a fun one.
And more specifically, we're going to be looking at I guess you could say the gap, the divide between liberal and conservative viewpoints in America.
The ever-present divide.
You guys have sent us some really interesting online pieces that offer kind of a peek into both sides of this. We're going to be sharing some of these with you and hopefully help you guys navigate this whole complex world and maybe even gain a more nuanced perspective.
Yeah, because it's definitely not black and white, that's for sure.
Not at all. And we're going to be getting into, we're even going to be looking at how the rest of the world sees American politics, which can be pretty eye-opening, to say the least.
Oh, yeah, some of those takes they're definitely something else.
Yeah, they're interesting. They're interesting. So, for our first source, we're diving right in. We've got a collection of notes here from someone who identifies as a leftist.
Okay, cool.
And it's basically a list of what they call frustrating Republican viewpoints.
Right.
And they kind of lay it all out there. They don't hold back at all.
That's good. That's what we like. We like to dive right into the deep end.
Exactly, exactly. So they touch on a lot of things, from climate change to LGBTQ plus issues, even the January 6th insurrection. It's a pretty strong critique of what they see as common Republican viewpoints.
This source seems to get right to the heart of this kind of emotional divide that exists.
Yeah.
It's not even just about different policy ideas. It's like these deeply held beliefs,
Yeah.
fears, frustrations, all the stuff that can just make it really hard to even have a rational discussion.
Yeah, and they kick things off right away with climate change. They talk about climate change denial, and they even bring up that incident where a senator, I don't know if you remember this, brought a snowball onto the Senate floor
Oh, yes.
to try to disprove global warming.
As if that was the thing that was going to prove or disprove it.
The snowball incident. Do you think moments like that whole snowball thing, do you think that actually sways people's opinions about climate change?
I don't know if it's about the snowball itself. I
Mhm.
think for some people, it's more about what the snowball represents.
Mhm.
It's like this symbol of distrust in scientific authority,
Yeah.
especially the kind of authority that maybe they see as elitist or just out of touch with their daily lives. And I think we also have to consider the industries, the businesses that really benefit from keeping things the way they are when it comes to climate policy.
Makes sense, yeah. And then, of course, they get into how the January 6th insurrection is viewed. This author claims that Republicans tend to either downplay it, justify it, or even blame it on Democrats.
Well,
It's like they're looking at the same event, but they're just seeing something totally different.
yeah, this is a perfect example of how much our own realities are shaped by the information that we take in.
Yeah.
It's like you've got these online echo chambers, these super partisan media outlets, and they're constantly reinforcing what people already believe.
Yeah, yeah.
So it makes it hard to even agree on like the basic facts of what happened. And then you end up with different groups living their own separate realities, basically.
Yeah.
They're talking past each other instead of having a real conversation.
It's wild. And it's not just huge events like January 6th. They also get into how Republicans talk about LGBTQ plus issues, and specifically their use of the word grooming. It's obviously a really charged term, and in this context, it feels very inflammatory. Honestly, kind of dangerous.
It is. It
Yeah.
is a dangerous term.
Yeah.
I think it's concerning because it really taps into a lot of the anxieties that people have around social change and their, more traditional values.
Mhm.
For some people, seeing LGBTQ plus folks gaining visibility and acceptance, it's seen as a threat to the way things have always been, the way they're used to.
Mm.
And that fear, unfortunately, is something that can be easily exploited by politicians, by people who use really divisive rhetoric just to energize their base.
Yeah, it definitely feels like some words like grooming are kind of weaponized to get that reaction, that
Yeah.
fear reaction.
Unfortunately.
And then you have things like, their frustration with how Republicans view immigration.
Right.
They talk about how it's painted as this major threat to American culture, to our identity.
Yeah, immigration has always been such a hot button issue, hasn't it?
It has, it has.
It's so often framed through the lens of economic anxiety, national security,
Mm-hmm.
even cultural preservation.
Mm-hmm.
And those are all real issues.
Right.
But when you only talk about them with fear and scapegoating, well, it's hard to have a productive conversation.
Yeah, it gets messy. It gets really messy. And if all that wasn't enough, this author also claims that Republicans view Democrats as this radical leftist cabal, which in reality, Democrats are actually pretty moderate.
I mean, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I would say so.
That's the thing about labels, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
They oversimplify these complex ideologies.
Right.
And they create this us versus them mentality.
Yeah.
And that kind of thinking, in a world that's already so polarized, those labels, they just become weapons. It shuts down any nuanced conversation. It demonizes people who just happen to have different views.
It's tough. It's really tough. And this source even calls out those who claim to be victims of censorship, even though they have a big presence on a lot of media platforms.
Mm.
Do you think there's any truth to that, or is it just a case of everyone wanting to be the underdog?
I think it's honestly a pretty complex issue.
Mhm.
On one hand, you do have legitimate concerns about media ownership,
Yeah.
how if a few big companies control so much of what we see and hear.
Yeah.
And that does have a real impact on the variety of viewpoints that get shared.
Mhm.
But then you have the whole rise of social media, right?
Right.
It's given a platform to people in groups with some really fringe views.
Yeah.
And a lot of it, honestly, isn't even based in reality. So navigating all that, it's a minefield.
Mhm.
And when someone cries censorship, a lot of times it's just a way to make opposing views seem less legitimate. It's a tactic.
Yeah, it's a tactic. This source even mentions some pretty out there claims, like that whole Jewish space lasers thing, or the idea that Taylor Swift's popularity is some kind of CIA operation.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, where do these conspiracy theories even come from?
Conspiracy theories tend to thrive in places where there's a lot of uncertainty and distrust, right?
Yeah.
They give simple answers to really complicated events, and they tap into existing prejudices and fears.
Yeah.
Plus, they spread so easily online. You know how these algorithms work? They create echo chambers that just keep feeding those beliefs.
Right, right.
And debunking them, it's so hard because they're often based on twisted facts and this deep suspicion of anything official.
So it's not just a Republican thing then?
Not at all. This tendency to believe in conspiracy theories, you see it everywhere. Across different ideologies, different groups. It's often fueled by a lack of trust in pretty much all institutions. And a desire to have like these simple explanations for things that are actually really complex.
Yeah, it's easier to have the simple answer.
Way easier.
Yeah, I guess so. So this first source, it paints a pretty critical picture of the Republican viewpoint. But I'm wondering, are these just like fringe beliefs, or do they represent something more mainstream within the party?
I think that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
We have to remember that any large group, especially a political party, you're going to have a whole range of different opinions.
Right.
It's really dangerous and unfair to label an entire group based on the views of just some of its members.
I see your point. It makes you wonder how we can even start to bridge this gap in understanding when there's, such a strong difference in opinion.
And I think that's what we're here to try and figure out, right?
Yeah.
And I think a good place to start is to look at the history, at the social forces that lead to these different viewpoints. We can't just write them off as crazy or ignorant.
We have to understand what causes them. The fears, the anxieties, the way people get information, even the way misinformation spreads.
Right, so it's not just about changing minds, it's about understanding where those minds are coming from in the first place.
Exactly.
Now, this source also has this bold claim about Republicans having a strong hold on social media. And they actually call some media outlets, quote, fascist propaganda networks, even though they present themselves as fair and balanced.
That's interesting. It really brings us to this really important question of media bias, and the role that big media companies play in shaping how people think.
Yeah.
Do some political ideologies have more power than others to control the narrative? How do these different media bubbles contribute to the polarization of viewpoints? Those are some big questions we're going to wrestle with.
It's like everyone's living in their own little media world. You've got your conservative news sources, your liberal news sources.
Yeah.
And it's so rare for anyone to even peek outside of their comfort zone.
How can we even start to break down these echo chambers and have real conversations when everyone's getting their information from such different places?
We'll definitely tackle that a little bit later. But first, I think it's really important to get a bigger perspective on American politics. We've talked about the divisions inside the country, but what about how these conflicts look from the outside, from a global perspective?
Right, because it's not just Americans who are dealing with this political divide. The whole world is watching. And our next source dives right into that global perception of American politics. And to be honest, it's not a very flattering picture.
Okay, interesting.
The author's main point is that America has lost a lot of respect on the world stage. They say it's because of our internal divisions, the political choices we make, and even some of our societal values.
Wow, that's a pretty tough assessment.
Yeah, and they point to things like gun violence,
Right.
the high cost of healthcare in America, even though our outcomes aren't that great compared to other countries. And then there's the massive amount of money we spend on the military.
That's a common critique.
They also criticize how we treat our poor and vulnerable populations, the whole issue of mass incarceration, and what they see as a rejection of science in favor of misinformation.
It's definitely a harsh critique.
It is.
But I think it's important to understand how those global perceptions develop. It's a mix of a lot of things. How the media portrays America, historical events, cultural differences,
It's complicated.
all of that plays a role in how other countries see the United States.
Yeah, it's definitely not just one simple answer. So it's easy to dismiss these outside criticisms, but do you think there's any value in listening to them? I mean, do they give us a chance to see ourselves in a different light?
I think they offer some really valuable insights into how our actions, how our policies are seen from the outside.
Mm.
It can be uncomfortable to look in the mirror and see flaws,
Yeah,
but if we can do that, then maybe we can start to address them.
I hear you. So how accurate are these perceptions? I mean, are we really as bad as this author makes us out to be?
Well, there's no denying that America has some really serious challenges. Deep inequalities, a political system that's constantly gridlocked, and a media landscape that just loves to spread misinformation and create more division.
Right.
So yeah, some of the criticisms might be oversimplified, they might lack some nuance, but they're pointing to real areas where we need to do better.
I see your point. It sounds like this global perspective, it kind of reflects a lot of the frustrations that we saw in that first source, especially when it comes to things like social justice and the way our government works.
Yeah, I think both sources are pointing to this overall feeling of disillusionment.
Hmm.
Like people have lost faith in American institutions. The first one focuses on the division inside the country, while the second one looks at how those issues are seen from the outside.
Right, right.
And ultimately, it's hurting our standing in the world.
So we've got these two sources highlighting the problems, both internally and externally.
Right.
But the big question is, where do we go from here? How do we turn things around? Can we bridge these massive divides?
I think it goes back to that challenge that the first source posed.
Yeah.
Are we, as individuals and as a society, are we truly ready to listen to each other's viewpoints?
Yeah, because if we're not even willing to listen, then we're basically just stuck in this endless loop of shouting and blaming.
Exactly.
We have to find a way to have civil discourse, even when we disagree, especially when we disagree strongly.
I think that's the key. We need to recognize that people can have different opinions without being bad people, you know?
Hmm.
And most importantly, we have to be willing to find common ground. Maybe that means putting aside some of our own preconceived notions. Maybe it means being open to learning something new or seeing things from a perspective we hadn't considered before.
I get that. But some of the viewpoints in these sources are, they're pretty extreme, like that snowball incident. Can we really take those kinds of arguments seriously?
That's a really good point. It is absolutely crucial to approach those extreme viewpoints with a critical eye. Don't just take them at face value. Ask yourself, what evidence supports this? Are there other perspectives I should be considering? And maybe most importantly, what are the consequences of believing and spreading these ideas?
Because not all opinions are created equal. Some are based on evidence and facts, while others are based on misinformation or even harmful ideologies.
Exactly. And as informed citizens, it's our job to be able to tell the difference. We need to develop critical thinking skills, be aware of our own biases, and be wary of information that seems too good to be true, or just confirms what we already believe without questioning it.
So it's about being a savvy consumer of information.
Yes, especially in this world of social media and 24/7 news. So how do we do that? How do we become more discerning?
Yeah, how do we cut through all the noise?
One of the most effective things you can do is diversify your media diet.
Okay.
Don't just stick to sources that reinforce your existing worldview. Seek out different perspectives, even the ones that challenge you.
So get out of that echo chamber.
Exactly. And make a conscious effort to engage with news and analysis from reliable sources. Look for sources from across the political spectrum.
That makes a lot of sense. If you're only hearing one side of the story, you're not getting the full picture. It's like trying to understand a painting by only looking at one color.
Exactly.
You mentioned reliable sources. How can we even tell which sources are credible and which ones are just pushing an agenda?
It's a skill, and it definitely takes time and practice to develop. One important indicator is whether a source has a history of being accurate and fact-checking their information.
Okay, so look at their track record.
Yes. Look for news outlets that are transparent about their methods and have a reputation for good journalism. Another big factor is funding. Who's supporting this organization? Do they have any interests that might be swaying their reporting?
So it's not just about finding sources that agree with our views, it's about finding sources that prioritize truth and accuracy above everything else.
Exactly. Do you think this kind of media literacy, do you think it should be something that we teach in schools?
Absolutely, 100%. I mean, in today's world, being able to evaluate sources and spot misinformation, it's essential. It's crucial for being an informed citizen and just navigating this crazy world.
I completely agree. It's a vital skill. So, with all the misinformation and division out there, is there any hope for us to bridge these divides?
Yeah. Are
Yeah.
we just destined to be at odds forever?
I believe there's always hope,
Hmm.
but it's not going to be easy, and it's certainly not going to happen quickly. It takes constant effort from all of us.
Mm.
We need to be willing to listen, to learn from each other, and to try to find that common ground, even when we disagree.
You're saying we shouldn't just give up. We can actually come together.
I think we can. Change rarely happens overnight,
Right.
but it does happen.
Yeah.
It often starts with people having brave conversations, challenging their own assumptions, and looking for commonalities with those who hold different views.
Mm-hmm.
It's about planting seeds of understanding and nurturing a culture of empathy. And those seeds might eventually grow into something amazing.
I like that. Okay, I'm feeling a little more optimistic.
Yeah.
But how do we actually put this into practice? What can we do as individuals to help this healing process? Because tackling these huge systemic problems, it can feel really overwhelming.
It can. It can. But even the smallest acts of kindness and understanding, they can have a ripple effect.
Okay, I like that.
You can start by having those tough conversations with people who hold different political views.
Yeah.
Not to argue, but to really listen and try to see where they're coming from.
Hmm.
You could also volunteer for an organization that promotes dialogue and understanding, or even just try to be more aware of your own biases in your everyday interactions.
So it's about focusing on those one-on-one interactions, those personal connections.
Yes, exactly. Don't underestimate the power of those individual conversations. They might not change the world overnight, but they can plant those seeds. And those seeds, they can grow.
And those small actions can eventually add up to something much bigger.
Absolutely. And it's not just about talking. It's also about actively listening.
Mm.
Try to truly hear what the other person is saying, even if it makes you a little uncomfortable.
Right.
Ask questions to clarify, rephrase what they've said to make sure you really understand.
So instead of just waiting for our turn to speak, we should be genuinely trying to understand where they're coming from, even if we disagree.
Exactly. And when you do share your own view, try to do it in a way that's respectful and avoids inflammatory language.
Right.
The goal is dialogue, not a shouting match.
Right. Because just calling someone names or putting down their beliefs, it's just going to shut down the conversation.
Exactly. And it's also important to think about the context of the conversation. Are you talking to a close friend or family member? Or is this a stranger on social media? How you approach the conversation might be different depending on the relationship and the setting.
Yeah, I get that. You probably wouldn't handle a political debate on Twitter the same way you would with your uncle at Thanksgiving.
Exactly. And, it's okay to agree to disagree. Not every conversation needs to end with someone changing their mind. Sometimes the goal is simply to understand each other better, to find a little common ground, even if it's just a sliver.
So even if we don't convince someone to totally switch sides, just having a conversation where we listen to each other can be a positive step.
Absolutely. It's about planting those seeds of understanding and building empathy. And those seeds, they have the potential to grow into something more.
Okay, I'm starting to see how we might be able to bridge this divide, at least on an individual level, but what about the bigger picture?
Right.
These sources paint a pretty bleak picture of American politics and society overall. Is there any hope for real systemic change?
That's a really complex question, and there's no easy answer. But I think it's important to remember that societies are always changing. What feels impossible today might shift with time and changing circumstances. History shows us that progress isn't always linear. It happens in bursts, through grassroots movements, policy changes, and shifts in social norms.
So you're saying we shouldn't lose hope.
Exactly. Change takes time and effort. It requires challenging the status quo and believing that a better future is possible.
Hmm.
And remember, you're not alone in wanting positive change. There are so many people and organizations working tirelessly to address these issues and create a more just and equitable society.
That's good to hear. So maybe, just maybe, by having these tough conversations and trying to understand each other, we can start moving things in a more positive direction.
I think so. It's going to take open minds, open hearts, and a willingness to step outside our comfort zones and connect with those who see the world differently than we do.
Okay, so we've covered a lot today. We've talked about the challenges of political discourse in America, how the world sees us, and the importance of critical thinking, empathy, and respectful dialogue. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to leave you with something concrete. So, given everything we've discussed, what are some specific steps you can take to create more understanding and bridge the political divide in your own communities?
That's a great question. And I think it starts with small individual actions. Something as simple as talking to someone who has different political views than you. Not to argue, but to really listen and try to see their perspective. You could also volunteer for an organization that's working to promote dialogue and understanding, or even just be more mindful of your own biases in your everyday interactions.
I think those are all great suggestions. It's about taking those little steps, those individual actions that might seem small on their own, but together can make a difference.
Exactly. And remember, it's not about being perfect or always getting it right. It's about being willing to try, to learn, and to keep moving forward toward greater understanding and empathy.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the American political landscape. It's complicated, it's always changing, but hopefully this conversation has given you some new insights and maybe even inspired you to take action in your own communities.
Yes, absolutely.
Remember, even small steps can have a big impact. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep trying to make the world a more understanding and compassionate place.
I love that. I think that's a perfect place to end this part of our conversation.
Yeah, I agree. It's a lot to think about, but it's important work.
Absolutely. And I'm looking forward to continuing this discussion in our next episode.
Me too. We've got a lot more to unpack, and I'm excited to dive even deeper into these issues. So until next time, keep those conversations going, and remember, we're all in this together.
Yes, we are. And who knows? Maybe we can make a difference.
I think we can.
I do too.
Right?
Yeah, it's easy to just brush off criticism from outside the U.S.,
Yeah.
you know? But I think these global perspectives, they can really help us see how our actions and our policies, they impact how other countries see us.
It's like getting a reality check.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. It can be tough to look at ourselves and see, maybe where we're not doing so well,
Yeah.
but that's how we grow, right? If we can see those flaws, maybe you can actually start to fix them.
I hear you. So how accurate are these perceptions, though? I mean, are we really as bad as this author's making us out to be?
Well, there's no denying that America has its problems.
Right.
Like you said, we have deep inequalities, a political system that seems to get stuck all the time, and a media landscape that thrives on misinformation and division.
Yeah, it's a lot.
It is. So while some of these criticisms might be a little too simple, maybe missing some of the nuances, they're pointing to real areas where we can improve.
I see your point. It seems like this global perspective kind of overlaps with a lot of the frustrations from that first source, especially when it comes to things like social justice and how well our government actually works.
Yeah, I think both sources are kind of getting at this sense of disillusionment.
Yeah.
Like people have lost faith in American institutions.
Hmm.
The first one focuses on the divisions inside the country, while the second one looks at how those issues are seen from the outside looking in.
Right, right.
And ultimately, it's affecting how the world sees us.
So we've got these two sources basically highlighting problems, both from inside the U.S. and from the outside.
Yeah.
But where do we go from here? Is there any way to fix things? Can we actually bridge these massive divides?
That's the big question, isn't it? And I think it goes back to what that first source asked. Are we as individuals and as a country ready to truly listen to each other?
Because if we're not willing to listen, then we're just going to keep yelling at each other and pointing fingers.
Exactly. We need to figure out how to have civil conversations, even when, and especially when we completely disagree.
Yeah.
We have to accept that people can have different opinions without being bad people. And I think the most important thing is we need to be willing to find common ground. Maybe that means letting go of some of our own preconceived ideas or being open to learning something new. Even seeing things from a different perspective.
I get that. But some of the viewpoints in these sources, I mean, they're pretty out there. Like that whole snowball incident. Can we really take those kinds of arguments seriously?
You raise a good point. We absolutely should approach those more extreme views with a critical eye. You can't just take everything at face value.
Yeah.
Ask yourself, what evidence is there to support this? Are there other perspectives I should be thinking about? And maybe even more importantly, what are the consequences of believing and spreading these ideas?
Because not every opinion is equally valid. Some opinions are based on facts and evidence, while others are based on misinformation or even harmful ideologies.
You're absolutely right. And as informed citizens, it's our responsibility to be able to tell the difference. We need to develop critical thinking skills,
Yeah.
be aware of our own biases, and be cautious of information that seems too good to be true or that just confirms what we already believe without any questioning.
It's about being a smart consumer of information.
Exactly. Especially in this age of social media and constant news. So how do
Yeah.
we become more discerning? How do we cut through all the noise?
Yeah, how do we figure out what's real and what's not?
One of the best things you can do is diversify your media diet. Don't just stick to the sources that reinforce what you already believe. Seek out different viewpoints, even the ones that challenge you.
Get out of that echo chamber.
Exactly.
Sure.
And make a real effort to engage with news and analysis from sources that, are reliable. Look for sources from across the political spectrum.
That makes sense. If you're only hearing one side of the story, you're not getting the whole picture. It's like trying to understand a painting by only looking at one color.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You mentioned reliable sources. How do we figure out which ones are credible and which ones are just trying to push an agenda?
Yeah, that's a good question. How do we know who to trust?
It's definitely a skill, and it takes practice. One thing to look for is whether a source has a good track record of being accurate and fact-checking their information.
Yeah. So check their history.
Yeah. Look for news outlets that are open about how they do things and have a reputation for good journalism. Another thing to consider is funding. Who's paying for this organization? Do they have any biases that might be influencing their reporting?
So it's not just about finding sources that agree with us. It's about finding sources that care about truth and accuracy above all else.
Absolutely.
Huh.
Do you think this kind of media literacy should be something we teach in schools?
I think it's crucial. I mean, in today's world, being able to evaluate sources and recognize misinformation is so important. It's essential for being an informed citizen and just navigating the world.
I completely agree. It's a vital skill.
Yeah.
So with all the misinformation and division out there, is there any hope for us to actually bridge these divides? Are we just destined to be fighting forever?
Yeah, it can feel pretty hopeless sometimes.
I know, but I really do believe there's always hope. It's not going to be easy, though, and it's definitely not going to happen overnight. It requires consistent effort from all of us.
Mm.
We have to be willing to listen, to learn from each other, and to find common ground, even when we disagree.
You're saying we shouldn't just give up. We can actually come together.
I truly believe we can.
Yeah.
Change rarely happens quickly, but it does happen. It often starts with individuals having those difficult conversations, challenging their own assumptions, and finding commonalities with people who have different views. It's about planting those seeds of understanding and nurturing a culture of empathy. And those seeds just might grow into something amazing.
I like that. Okay. I'm feeling a little more hopeful. But how do we actually make this happen? What can we do as individuals to contribute to this healing process? Because let's be honest, tackling these huge systemic problems, it can feel pretty overwhelming.
It can. But even the smallest acts of kindness and understanding can make a difference.
Yeah.
They can have a ripple effect.
Okay. I like that.
You can start by having those difficult conversations with people who have different political viewpoints than you.
Yeah.
Not to argue, but to genuinely listen and try to see where they're coming from. You could also volunteer for an organization that promotes dialogue and understanding, or even just make an effort to be more aware of your own biases in your everyday interactions.
So it's about focusing on those one-on-one interactions, those personal connections.
Exactly. Don't underestimate the power of those individual conversations. They might not change the world immediately, but they can plant those seeds, and those seeds can grow.
And all those small actions, they can build up to something much bigger.
Absolutely. And it's not just about talking either. It's also about truly listening. Try to hear what the other person is saying, even if it's not easy to hear.
Right.
Ask questions to clarify what they mean. Rephrase what they said to make sure you're understanding them correctly.
So instead of just waiting for our turn to talk, we should be making a real effort to understand where they're coming from, even if we don't agree with them.
Exactly. And when you do share your own view, try to do it respectfully and without using inflammatory language.
Right.
The goal is to have a dialogue, not a shouting match.
Right. Calling someone names or putting down their beliefs is only going to shut down the conversation.
Exactly. And it's also important to think about the context of the conversation. Are you talking to a close friend or family member? Or is this a stranger you're interacting with online? The way you approach the conversation might need to be different depending on the relationship and the situation.
Yeah, I get that. You wouldn't talk about politics on Twitter the same way you would with your uncle at Thanksgiving dinner.
Exactly.
Right.
And remember, it's okay to agree to disagree. Not every conversation has to end with someone changing their mind. Sometimes the goal is just to understand each other better, to find a little bit of common ground, even if it's just a tiny bit.
So even if we don't convince someone to switch sides, just having a conversation where we listen to each other can be a step in the right direction.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's about planting those seeds of understanding and nurturing a culture of empathy. And who knows, those seeds might grow into something more.
Okay. I'm starting to see how we might be able to bridge this divide, at least on a personal level. But what about the bigger picture? These sources paint a pretty negative view of American politics and society as a whole. Is there any hope for real change on a larger scale?
That's a tough question, and there's no easy answer. But I think it's important to remember that societies are always changing. What might seem impossible today could change over time as things evolve. Throughout history, we've seen that progress isn't always a straight line. It often happens in bursts through activism, policy changes, and shifts in social norms.
So you're saying we shouldn't give up hope?
Exactly. Change takes time and effort. It requires challenging the status quo and believing that a better future is possible. And remember, you're not alone in wanting to see positive change. There are so many people and organizations out there working hard to address these problems and create a more just and fair society.
That's good to hear. So maybe, just maybe, by having these conversations and trying to understand each other, we can start to move things in a better direction.
I think so. It's going to take open minds, open hearts, and a willingness to step outside of our comfort zones and connect with people who see things differently than we do.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today. We've explored how divided political discourse is in America, how the world sees our country, and how important critical thinking, empathy, and respectful dialogue are for bridging these gaps. But before we finish this part of our deep dive, I want to leave you with something concrete, something you can actually do. So given everything we've talked about, what are some specific actions you can take to create greater understanding and bridge the political divide in your own community?
That's a great question. And I think it starts with those small individual actions that we talked about. Something as simple as striking up a conversation with someone who has different political views than you. Not to argue, but to genuinely listen and try to understand their perspective. You could also volunteer with an organization that promotes dialogue and understanding, or even just make a conscious effort to be more aware of your own biases in your everyday life.
I think those are all great ideas. It's about taking those small steps, those individual actions that might seem insignificant on their own, but collectively can really contribute to a shift in our culture and how we talk to each other.
Exactly. And remember, it's not about being perfect or always getting it right. It's about being willing to try to stumble, to learn, and to keep moving forward toward more understanding and empathy.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the American political landscape. It's a complicated and constantly changing topic, but we hope this conversation has given you some new perspectives and maybe even inspired you to take action in your own communities. Remember, even small steps can make a difference. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep striving to make the world a more understanding and compassionate place.
Yeah, it's about moving away from this idea that we have to win every argument
Right.
and instead focusing on finding some common ground,
Yeah.
and building a society where everyone feels like they belong and like their voice is heard.
I love that, focusing on what unites us instead of what divides us. It's so easy to get caught up in all the negativity, the back and forth. But at the end of the day, we all want the same basic things, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
A safe and healthy place to live a good future for ourselves and our kids.
Right, exactly. And maybe just remembering that we all share those basic desires can help us have more productive conversations.
Absolutely. It helps us see each other as fellow citizens, not as enemies. We're all just trying to figure things out together.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot today. The challenges facing political conversations in America, how the rest of the world sees us, and how important it is to think critically, to have empathy, and to talk to each other respectfully. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with something you can actually do.
Okay, that's good.
So with everything we've discussed, what are some specific things our listeners can do to foster more understanding and maybe even bridge the political divide in their own communities?
That's a great question. And I think it starts with those small individual actions that we talked about earlier.
Hmm.
You know, maybe just strike up a conversation with someone who has different political views than you.
Okay.
And not to argue with them, but to really listen and try to understand where they're coming from.
Hmm.
You could also volunteer with a group that promotes dialogue and understanding, or even just try to be more aware of your own biases in your everyday life.
Those are all really good ideas, I think. It's about taking those small steps, those individual actions that might seem insignificant on their own, but when we all do them, they can really add up.
Exactly. And remember, it's not about being perfect or always getting it right. It's about being willing to try to make mistakes, to learn from them, and to just keep moving forward toward greater understanding and empathy.
And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the American political landscape. It's complicated, it's always changing, but we hope this conversation has given you some new insights and maybe even inspired you to get involved in your own communities. Remember, even small actions can make a difference. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep working to make the world a more understanding and compassionate place.
I love that. I think that's a perfect note to end on.
Yeah, I agree. It's a lot to think about, but it's important work.
Absolutely. And I'm really looking forward to continuing this discussion in our next episode.
Me too. We've got a lot more to unpack, and I'm excited to dive even deeper into these issues. So until next time, keep those conversations going, and remember, we're all in this together.
Yes, we are. And who knows? Maybe we can make a difference.
I think we can.